Hi, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Ask the Expert. And we are going to continue with last month's session on scripting best practices. This will be part 2. So welcome. My name is Steve Bell, and I am a ServiceNow MVP. I work for Accenture. I have 36 years in the industry as an architect and developer. I've also been an executive, so I've been up and down the ladder here. I've written over 150 articles in the community, ServiceNow community, and I've done a number of these Ask the Expert video sessions. I'm certified in 12 different topics to teach, and I also am certified specifically in service mapping, discovery as an application developer, and so on. My areas of expertise are CMDB, discovery, and scripting. So, to continue from last week, or last month, I should say, we were talking about scripting problems and how they tend to be kicked down the road. So, this is a thing where I'm seeing this a lot. I'm getting asked about this a lot. I'm also being asked by my company to go back and do mass peer reviews against our code base to validate that we are doing the coding best practices and development best practices as put together by our company. And this has led me to put together a variety of things, including peer review, architectural review, and to actually come up with ways of measuring this. So we have our standards, but we weren't doing a good job of policing and enforcing these standards. So now that that's been accomplished and we're back to internal training of standards, internal training of peer review, then we are policing our own crowd. This is something, though, that I'm also seeing with code we are inheriting. When we come on site with a customer, we sometimes get handed substandard code to go through, maintain, to correct, and so on. So what you're going to be seeing is things pulled from the code base I've found out on our customers, and then what the best practice is to go about cleaning that up. So I'm going to cover more bad coding techniques. I'm going to add more on commenting. I'm going to talk a lot about standards, and then also about what would be captured by a peer review or should be. Every one of these you see that I found is an actual point where we are, for our peer review process, to be able to correct that or capture it or identify it, if you will. We're trying to come up with a more extensive way of doing this, and that requires some automation. But and there are third-party tools that do some of this out there in the real world, but so far I have not seen anything that goes to the extent of the individual actually reviewing code. Okay, so previously, in the last session, I talked about the use of the alert and how you should avoid it. So what happens to the user's browser? Since this is modal, it actually locks the user's browser until that alert screen is closed. So if this is shipped into production, this could actually pop up in front of the customer or user, and that is an undesirable thing. The alert can be replaced with either gform add info message or add error message, which can put the messages up on the screen. But one of our architects brought up an interesting point. If you are going to be using something to do debugging with, you should use possibly JSLog. So in the last session, I mentioned just the gform add info message and so on, but the JSLog is also a very good thing to use. Now, JSLog is interesting. It throws things into the console. I have pros and cons on this. If you're monitoring the console, if you ever do that, by the way, and I highly recommend playing around with it. Just get into, let's say, Google Chrome, hit F12, and voila, you're monitoring several things having to do with the background processes for whatever website you're currently viewing. This is also inclusive of the console, and console logging is usually a no-no. Console.log is usually not condoned. JSLog also pushes into ServiceNow's front-end logging and allows you to do debugging without it appearing on the form. This one is, I have mixed emotions about it because it tends to get forgotten and ending up being shipped into production, where alert is very bad to get shipped into production. Message has it doesn't interrupt the user if an error occurs. It actually flags for the user that something bad has happened, and they can call their support staff and read the message to them. JSLog, on the other hand, would throw it into the background and you wouldn't be able to see it. Now, for something like this, yeah, I can lean towards JSLog and it would be acceptable. So anyway, get the idea. There is an alternative to add info message that I did not bring up in the last session, and I thought I'd do so this time around. Okay, next one, inconsistent coding techniques. Again, this is a lack of scripting standards. Gee, there is a bug in this top one too, which I just noticed. And by the way, I copied this intact out of code. So that open parenthesis or open squiggly right there is actually an error. But you get the idea. This compresses the code, and whereas this is valid code, and get rid of the alert, you would find that this is you know, again, it's difficult to maintain, can be difficult to read, especially if it's buried in a lot of other code. There's no extensibility to this code. In other words, it's hard to throw JS logs or add error or info messages in there to be able to get the information out during debugging side. You'd have to actually add the squigglies. If they're already there, it improves readability and helps with maintainability. And then, of course, getting rid of the alert. Whoop. I don't know why I did that.
Well, your audio there for a second. You were talking about.
Yeah, it was almost like my whole machine took a hitch because all of a sudden it took my my screen away and everything else. So sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so you get the idea. This is much more maintainable, much easier to read, and helps with debugging. If you need to put a debugging message in, you don't have to go in and add these things in. They're already there. Again, don't be a lazy programmer. Adding spaces in between things, like after the if and after the else, in between the bracket, surrounding the not equals here, actually allows it to jump out at you, and it's easier to read and easier to understand what's going on. It's okay to do this kind of stuff. Take the time to do it. Always keep in mind the maintainability. You may not be the one maintaining your code later on. Keep your shop clean. Okay, another one. Here we have, again, a problem because the brackets are not present. Notice that this else looks like it really belongs to the if up here because, you know, based on the indentation. So because there's no brackets, we don't know exactly what's going on here unless we put brackets in to try to straighten it out. In reality, what's going on is this else belongs to the second if. And the first if actually contains the second if. So this is very difficult to read, very difficult to maintain. The spacing is terrible. There are some shortcuts here that will make it much easier. One of those would be to get some of this if statement turned into binary before you move it into the if statement for checking on it. You know, anyway, it's terrible, and it's something that would easily be flagged by a reviewer and it'd be difficult to spot this as a automated device, any sort of automated program that goes through and checks for problems. This one would probably pass most of them. This is it, the same piece of code, a little bit better, a little bit easier to read. Notice the brackets have been added. It gives much more readability, and it also tends to make it a little easier to see that it can be refactored. When you get this kind of pattern, this is actually beautiful for this kind of refactoring. Notice this is exactly the same piece of code, exactly. But it's been refactored so that it's easier to maintain and easier to look at. Notice that the pattern for block and none from here has been actually turned into an inline if statement. So if you look here, it's now the if statement is part of a large Boolean, so it checks and it will give back block or none. So this is if adjusted with, and notice adjusted with now is a variable, a binary variable, is greater than or equal to with the delta, which is also now a binary variable or just a value, then the whole thing is evaluated, and it'll be true block, false none, and that will be then assigned to display. This reduces, by the way, a significant amount of error-prone work. There could be errors in this code. Now, again, back to the original, this is the original of that. And by the way, we will be posting this deck. This is the refactor, or actually the straightening out of the code, adding in the brackets and some white space and making it a little more readable. And then this is the final animal after it's been examined a little more thoroughly. This is so much easier to maintain. By the way, this is known as redirection, and what you're doing is you're assigning values to an actual variable and then utilizing that further down to help with readability. You make your code self-documenting. This could probably stand a couple of comments explaining the whole reasoning behind this, but as you notice, this is a very clear naming convention that tells, if there are more attachments and if there's a header attachment, then we want to set the display to block. And how we're doing the valuation of that is we're checking the adjusted width against the delta, and if if that adjusted width is greater than or equal to the delta, we can do blocking. Otherwise, we can't. So I'm looking at this. I didn't write this code. I wrote the refactor. I did not do the original, but this tells me everything I need to know just by looking at it. Okay, another one. Again, this one is rife with a variety of problems. I like the missing semicolon, which will probably show up in the editor just fine, but no one does anything about that. And by the way, I see this a lot with missing semicolons. I'm kind of guilty of it too, because I'll get in a hurry, won't be watching what I'm doing. Hey, the computer should know what I'm typing, right? And I'll leave a semicolon off, but I'll go clean it up on my final sweep. And the other one is, names that are totally nonsense. MGR, meaning modified group what, I guess, or to me this is short for manager. It's a capitalized variable, which you don't do. It violates several different JavaScript standards out there. The name is meaningless. It doesn't talk about modified group details at all. Rec type, that one kind of does. I mean, that one, yeah, I can lean toward it. It'd be better just to spell it out. Request type. What's wrong with spelling it out? It takes 5 more strokes to spell it out, or 4 more. Makes it readable. I don't have to guess at what it means. I have to guess at what manager means. So police the code after you're done. Indentation stinks on this. Readability is not that great. You get the idea. Here it is refactored. So spell out request type. Makes it easier to read. Further down, I know what it is. Group details. See, modify group detail. I could even say that it's modify group details, but I think it's, fine doing it this way. And then, of course, the missing semicolon gets added in. Straightened it out. Formatting's good now. It's easier to read, easier to maintain. This is one of my biggest pet peeves right here is obvious comments. So, you know, I can't even, it's kind of like obvious to me, yeah, email is being blanked, phone number is being blanked. Why do I need a comment telling me what the code is actually doing? This is like someone who's just learning JavaScript and writing a comment to themselves about what's actually happening here. Don't do this. I see this in production code, and it's something that is not worthy of a comment. So a couple of rules of thumbs on commenting here is, if it isn't obvious what's going on, then it probably needs a comment. The problem with it is if it isn't obvious what's going on, it probably requires more than just a couple of words for the comment, in which case put a comment above the line and tell what's the next section of code's doing. And that will make it easier to understand and maintain. Short comments are for things like if I set a, let's say on incidents, for example, if I've got something set for urgency to 2, then it probably help to have a comment explaining what the 2 means. And that would be something I could put on a side comment like this. That's kind of, it's kind of rare actually to have to do stuff like that. 9 times out of 10, commenting will end up going to the line above a section of code. Very, very not so often will you be using side comments, or should you. Don't put a sentence out here. I usually keep it down to 2 or 3 words. If it gets beyond that, bang, it goes to its own comment above. There is no reason to put the whole comment next to the line for the purposes of allowing your code to look pretty. It actually becomes then, it can wrap on screens. It can do all sorts of terrible things to your formatting. I'm a big believer in block comments. So putting 2 or 3 comments in front of a section of code explaining what that code's going to do, and therefore the code remains nice looking and the comment that is not intrusive and does not cause over-commenting issues. Over-commenting is another one that makes maintainability very difficult. And here's one of my favorite pet peeves of all, is the massive if-else if statement structure. This one right here can be so nicely cleaned up with a switch statement. And you can see, there's embedded comments. I'm okay with that if they're meaningful. This one is not, but I'm going to leave it in on the cleanup because I wasn't sure what the comment really meant. And until I understand the full structure of the code, I'm not going to change the commenting. So I leave these alone because they may mean something to somebody. Until I learn more about it, I'm not going to change it. I may add more comments in stating what I think is going on. But if you look at this, there are certain patterns here that could probably be pulled out and utilized. Notice this scratchpad cat item name has multiple values here that we're checking for. That's very useful and can actually be used in a switch statement as the determining factor if whether this gets used. And by the way, I've abbreviated this code. This is not exactly how the original was. It was much more gigantic. It did more mandatories, more read-onlys, more all this other stuff. And this was in a client script, an on-change client script. It was absolutely gigantic. There are different ways of handling that too, but for the purposes of showing coding do's and don'ts, this is one that I say avoid at all costs. This can be refactored. Also, if you notice, this cat item G scratchpad is ubiquitous. It's in every one of them. It's exactly the same. This can be pulled up into the if above it, or even in a separate if statement prior to entering into this code, and clean it up considerably. There is no reason to do this in every single if. So let's take a look at how this might be cleaned up. Okay, I pulled the cat item out as a indirection. So now I've just shortened this whole reference down to a simple catalog cat item variable. Check item is the cat item name. So it's I could say cat item name or check item here. Now I have a switch instead of the if then else if structure. And notice up here I pulled out that one that was ubiquitous everywhere, the G scratchpad check on the cat item, and reduced it down to this cat item here being checked against the cat item sysid. And I yanked it out of the if then else if structure and pulled it up to the if above it, created the switch, and then made each case in the switch equal to this this check that was being done. And it makes it so much easier to maintain. I can add it, easily maintain this by adding more stuff in or removing stuff, seeing what needs to be put into place, and it just makes it so much easier to read. I now can see what's going on, where I couldn't with this previous code. And you can tell this is ugly, difficult to maintain, nice, and easy to maintain. So readability has improved significantly with a switch. So no code. It's another one I see a lot. So what usually ends up happening with stuff like this is somebody's creating an else because they're debugging and something didn't work right. And so they had a debugging statement. Rather than removing the whole else portion of the structure, they left it in. And there's some interesting problems with this. I've actually seen this cause the eating of an error on some code. Can't point to 100% if it would happen in this case, but I've seen it happen in other cases where the else swallows up things. Try catches without a catch. I mean, it has a catch, but there's nothing in the catch. Similar issue. That one will definitely eat your error. So watch out for this. Don't allow this to go into production code. Another one is someone intended to put something here and didn't finish it. So when I'm looking for things as far as code review, one of my big flags is future code things like this, where they intended to put something in perhaps for the current release and forgot it, or they were putting extra code in because in the future they may put something here. If that's the case and they really wanted that to be flagged, put a comment in here saying, currently not doing anything with this, but in the future we will do this, that kind of stuff. Just let people know what the else is for. Otherwise, this is extra step that is totally useless to the computer. Get rid of it. There is no reason to have it. Even with future use, really that should be documented elsewhere, not in your code. Anyway, you get the idea. Another one, I love this one. I should have left the yellow off, but I thought I'd highlight it. Commented out code. Number one, get rid of, don't leave commented out code in production. This is a production piece of code. It was formatted just like you see it. I like the implied down here where it's indented all goofy for the while. So what happened probably, and I've seen this occur, is the GS log was added later. The commented out code was something they were working with and decided they didn't need. And so they left it in for the possibility they might need it in the future. Frankly, there's versioning inside ServiceNow. So when you write a script, it actually keeps versions. Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I just got pinged, said I stopped talking. All right, were you able to hear that on what I was talking about, or did I stop or anything like that?
There could have been.
Was there a gap anywhere?
Yeah, James said yes, so I'm not quite sure since I didn't hear the gap.
Yeah, the recording would pick up everything if you can hear it. So I wanted to make sure. Maybe something with YouTube.
Chuck Tomasi says, okay, everything's fine.
Great.
Okay.
All right. So the other part of this is, despite the fact that there's commented out code and the formatting stinks, the next piece is, that just leaps out at me is, what was template being used for? Notice it isn't used anywhere. And I checked all the further down code. I just wanted to bring this out. Unused variables, stuff that was put into place perhaps to be used and then decided that it wasn't necessary. And instead of going back and cleaning up the code, they left it in. And where this isn't a performance problem, it could be a maintenance issue later on. And creation of a single variable, I doubt it even takes a microsecond of the computer's time. But the left in unused variables could cause confusion with maintenance later on, and who knows what can happen. So best to remove this stuff. Your versioning will keep it, along with anything that's been commented out and then removed. Versioning will handle that. So there is no reason to do this kind of coding and release it into production. Watch out for it. Keep your eyes clear, peeled for it. This right here is a very common thing. And I usually will see large groups of variables and only about 4 or 5 out of 20 are actually being used. The rest of them are left there for whatever reason. So when I go through code cleanup, I have my developers either remove it or I'll go do it myself. So when it's all cleaned up, it's a lot easier to read. Indentation looks great, a lot nicer to deal with this code. Isn't that amazing? So this is the same piece of code. Okay, I removed all of the stuff, cleaned up all the formatting. And the only thing I could probably add to this would be comments saying, what this is actually accomplishing. But that I'd put up here at the top, and that'd be the only thing that's needed. I love this one. So this is stuff that was actually left in a piece of code. Makes me crazy. So they were actually declaring a variable inside of an if, and then using that same variable if, you get the idea. This would cause serious problems. By the way, the editor also flags this as a problem, saying shift was not, shift is out of scope or out of, out of usage. So initial fix for this would be to var it outside the if, move it up so the shift is false. And this is weird. I don't know why this was done this way. I mean, they set it true and then immediately set it to false. And then at the bottom, you'll see just a slight refactoring of this, where you can just turn it into a Boolean test and have it true or false, regardless. So then why would you want test there? Why not just 450 is greater than 400? I don't know what this whole piece of code was about. I found it in production and on one of our client instances and absolutely fell out of my chair laughing. Try not to ship this into production, please. And if you're doing stuff like this, think it through. But you get the idea. It's just wild. Okay, another pet peeve of mine. Returning out of the middle of a loop. Okay, this causes a performance hit. A lot of people aren't aware of the underlying garbage cleanup that goes on with JavaScript. So when you're returning out of a function, there's a cleanup that goes on, a destruction of a variety of different objects, variables, and things like that that are inside of the function, and only inside that scope of the function, then are destroyed. And this takes a moment to do that. When you're returning out, instead of the normal thing that happens at the very bottom of the function, which is the normal garbage cleanup, it has to go off and do special handling for garbage cleanup. So when you return out of the middle of stuff like this, it has to go kill and destroy everything. It does it anyway down at the bottom, but it's more efficient. It's under, this is an anticipated prepped for destroy versus an unanticipated destroy. So it's also a maintainability issue as far as the structure is concerned, because it lends itself to not really understanding what's necessarily being returned. Here, pretty straightforward, you're returning an error. Actually, the desire to do this puzzles me a little bit. One of the things I would point to is to throw an error rather than to return an error, unless you plan on having what's called graceful degradation. But then you should have a try-catch above this that when you throw an error would handle the error higher. So if you're wanting to return an error, there are other ways of doing this where the garbage collection is done much more efficiently. So do a throw instead of return, perhaps here. Anyway, so at the beginning of the code, you have a lot of stuff going on inside the function that probably would be better served outside the function. So I created an object and passed the object in. What's nice about this is that I can put the error in the object. If I want to handle it or hang on to it, why not just have an object that I pass in and it gets passed out by reference. So this is a little bit easier way of doing things, a lot cleaner way of doing things. Plus, you can then manipulate the object without having to do crazy things like return out of the middle of a while. So what happens? This chunk of code then begins to look like this. So the while, I have a break here. I've set my object information, and now I'm returning. This return isn't even necessary. I could get rid of it because this is by ref here. So I can actually dump the return altogether. And this object will automatically be updated when I do this down here. Notice I'm doing indirection. This indirection is easier to maintain. I don't have these long object names down below. There's no problem with doing the long object names. It just makes it a little easier to mess with. But you get the idea. I'd have incident handler dot error dot message equals, that error dot message, stuff like that. So this is another way of handling it that's a lot more graceful, a little bit better engineering, but you get an understanding of a better way to handle it than doing a return out of the middle. This is actually lazy because the person didn't really want to spend the time to develop the code correctly. Okay, another one. Again, it's a performance thing. Notice the for loop here, returning out of the middle. Garbage collection, again, is then immediately invoked. It's forced, if you will, and it requires the computer to go off and do some extra work. And, it doesn't do what's anticipated. Also notice we're not returning anything with this, where an object is obviously the thing that that is desired to be returned. All that happens here is we get an info message, fed back to the form, and that's all that happens. So I have a problem with the code overall, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that it's returning out of a loop. Again, break would have been a much better thing. Then you get the actual incident list that what you have is returned for whatever reason it was being called with. Notice that nothing's happening with this. And honestly, this is out of production piece of code. I just wanted to show how to get rid of the return. But notice that they're returning the incident list, but it's not being utilized. So they run the program, and I love the name of the function too. That was another crack me up. For me, I tend to rewrite everything. I get in there on something like this. I change the names. I fix it up so it's doing what it's supposed to do. If it needs to even do that, I'll set up objects and use the objects as JavaScript is very object-based. It is very useful in that regard and allows for much smoother coding. I look over everything very carefully and see if we really want to do what we want to do. This is obviously a leftover debugging of some sort. You know, I really called into question the entire function. Okay, so that was pretty much all I wanted to bring out in this particular session. I will be doing another one of these here at the beginning of next month. When's our next one again, Lisa?
Let me pull up the calendar. We've changed it from the 6th to, actually, it's now June 11th.
June 11th. Okay, well, so we'll be doing number 3 on this. I'll be getting into more complex examples that I'm finding out there and how how I suggest they be resolved. Also, in the final session, which will be part 4, I'll be taking one gigantic chunk of code and showing how it should be redone and refactored, and give you a more practical experience of a lot of this kind of problems, a lot of these kind of problems I'm seeing in the real world. Again, I want to emphasize, don't be lazy about this. A lot of this stuff is, I just don't want to do the due diligence to get it done right. You know, develop a standard and stick to it. Take the extra time. It's only a few seconds usually for commenting. It's not hours. You know, if it takes a couple of minutes, then take a couple of minutes, but do it right. And then my big one is implement a peer review if you have more than one programmer. I mean, if you've got 2 developers doing stuff, then have the other developer look your code over according to the standard. Okay, and again, back to own your code. I don't know how many people basically write the code and then walk away. Assume that the code is going to be used by someone else and that you will be embarrassed if it's a messed up piece of code. I have a good example here. One of our lead developers, he's actually a senior architect, is Mark Amon, who I do a lot of co-presentations with at Knowledge. He was on one of our projects and had developed a very large orchestration project for them. The whole thing had a tremendous amount of custom code underneath it, and most of it in script includes. When I walked in the door, metaphorically speaking, since everything's virtual with us, he was being pulled out to go work on another project where he was extremely critical, so they backfilled him with me. And when I walked in the door, it was beautiful. I mean, I can't say it any better. The code was exactly according to our standards. Everything was nicely laid out, naming practices, indentation, the way the code was laid out, the structure, the architecture, everything was absolutely spot on. And what ended up happening was I was assigned several stories the minute I walked in the door that had been assigned to Mark, and you know, they had criticality to them, so I looked at them. I was able to actually solve 4 of those on my first day on the project. I went in, it was obvious where the modification needed to be made in the code. These were things that they wanted done for enhancement purposes, and I did them all in a single day and absolutely blew the client right out of the water. They absolutely were amazed that I could be productive the same day I walked in the door. And I really tip my hat to Mark because he did it right. He took the extra time and created a situation that made it easy for me to take over from him and not skip a beat. The customer's anticipation was that I would take a week to come up to steam on the code before I would be productive at all. And not only was I productive the same day, it was as if Mark was still there to them, they said. You know, it's just like we were totally interchangeable. But that was Mark's coding practice. I was able to take over from him, and everything was exactly how it should be and how it should have been anticipated, and I could understand it when I looked at it. So they wanted a modification? Okay, easy. I go out and make the mod. So you get the idea. It is really important to have this kind of standard in place, even for your own shop. You know, for us as consultants, I would say it's doubly so that we do a good job with our code. With the you know, with your own shop and your own development team, set something up that's reasonable and begin working with it. enforce it. And as you take on staff, or as you bring in new people, run them through the training on what they need to do and what's expected of them, and then do peer reviews to enforce it. And again, use reasonable amounts of things. Don't go overboard with error handling. I've seen it done horribly, where there was so much error handling, you wondered what it was they were actually checking for. Try catches inside try catches inside try catches. One of the most nauseating things I'd seen. And it was obvious that they were just trying to engineer it so nothing could ever go wrong, but instead they made it over-engineered and it became unreasonable to maintain. Too much commenting. Oh my gosh, I've seen stuff that was so commented, it was like for every line of code there was 2 or 3 lines of comments, and you almost couldn't read the code. I ended up moving the comments out into a description field and then trying to figure out where a real comment needed to be. So be careful with comments. Self-commenting code, self-documenting code, best kind of code there is. Minimal comments are needed. The code speaks for itself. Make it your own. Own the code. Own the process. Can't emphasize it enough. Okay, again, this is the same recap. I haven't changed anything from last session. Build solid code. Do it right. Do the due diligence. And then make it maintainable and handle the errors. There is a craft behind this. There is engineering processes that should, at very minimum, that I've described, throughout this, that should be taken into account when you're developing. I like this one, sensibility. Yeah, it can overboard on it, so be careful. Do the right thing. Okay, I've got several articles out on the community that I highly recommend. Also, there's an excellent JavaScript standard out at Airbnb, and this JavaScript standard is one of the best I've seen out there, and I've reviewed a significant number of these. I try not to write a JavaScript standard for our company. I've started on it once, but I found that other people have already done the work and have published it out for general consumption. So, this one may not be one that you're interested in utilizing, but I highly recommend looking at it. There are a significant number of things then that need to be done on top of that. So what you do is you find a standard that's for JavaScript, you hold to that standard, and then on top of that, you do things for ServiceNow. So we've got a whole bunch of things that we look for as far as standards are concerned on how we want ServiceNow API code to be written. So as we do glide records, for example, we want them done a certain way. Mark Amon and I did a presentation on glide record best practices, and it was all development best practices. It was at a CreatorCon theater at K19. Might be able to do something like that later on in one of these Ask the Expert sessions, and maybe I can get Mark to help out. But
that would be great. I would love that. Yeah.
It just takes it's really a lot of the same stuff I'm presenting here, where it's formatting and error checking and things like that, but it's specific for glide record handling. But it can be done for almost any part of the API, and that is, that's the thing about the ServiceNow standards side, is that you can go and create these specific examples, but really we found that the do's and don'ts kind of documentation I'm showing you here goes a lot further, because it says here's one thing we'll be checking for while we review your code, and this is the solution we expect to be done for if we do find this problem. And in reality, what it does is it says, you see how this code is being done here? Don't do that. Do it this way. And with the example set that we've put together for our own teams, it actually goes a lot further, and we end up with some nice code. There's a lot of best practices too that I've covered in articles previously having to do with developing scoped applications that perhaps we can do a session or two on for dealing with how best to implement scoped environments, scoped library handling, things like that. I've done a couple of sessions on Ask the Expert on that already, but it all stems from having good standards in place before you can build on that. Okay, any questions Anything anyone want to bring up? A little bit shorter session today. The stuff I wanted to get into for the next session, it's like one slide and then 15 minutes and one slide, 15 minutes kind of stuff. So I was careful. Didn't want to go over today.
I'm still seeing if there's going to be any questions coming in. I don't see any on the YouTube chat. Let me just check the community. And of course, anyone, you can always come back and post questions on that community link that I provided. So Stephen will come back and answer them directly. Let's see. No, something, not so far, but sometimes it takes a while for people to type their questions.
Sure.
And then we're going to have something in July, which will be CMDB best practices part 2. Is that correct?
Right. Yes. I'll be talking on how to implement some of the things that I talked on in my session in February. So I did a CMDB fundamentals or basics session in February, and through that I mentioned several things about how to implement certain components of the into the CMDB to make CMDB life a lot better. And I'm going to talk to that in that session.
Okay, great. All right, I'm not seeing anything else, but well, thank you so much again, Stephen, as usual, and we appreciate it, and we can't wait for your next session.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.